It is the pre-dawn darkness of July 17, 1918. In the remote city of Yekaterinburg, within the walls of a merchant's home now known by the chilling euphemism, the House of Special Purpose, the last ruling dynasty of Russia is waiting. Tsar Nicholas II, the Tsarina Alexandra, their four beautiful daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia the young heir, Alexei. They have been stripped of their crown, their power, and their liberty. Now they are about to be stripped of their lives. But the absolute certainty of that night was destroyed by the sheer brutality of the act itself. When the Bolshevik executioners dragged the bloody, broken bodies from the cellar, they were short. 2 bodies were missing. For 70 years, the silence of the Russian soil covered an impossible secret, fueling the 20th century's greatest historical myth, that one of the imperial daughters, the youngest and most spirited, Grand Duchess Anastasia, had escaped. This is a story of wealth beyond measure, revolution, terror, and the enduring hope that history could be kinder than fate. We are going to dive into the evidence, the pretenders, the decades-long legal battles, and the modern DNA science that finally answered the question, did Anastasia Romanov survive the massacre that ended the Russian Empire? This is a story of wealth beyond measure, revolution, terror, and the enduring hope that history could be kinder than fate. We are going to dive into the evidence, the pretenders, the decades-long legal battles, and the modern DNA science that finally answered the question, did Anastasia Romanov survive the massacre that ended the Russian Empire? This is a story of wealth beyond measure, revolution, terror, and the enduring hope that history could be kinder than fate. We are going to dive into the evidence, the pretenders, the decades-long legal battles, and the modern DNA science that finally answered the question, did Anastasia Romanov survive the massacre that ended the Russian Empire? To understand the tragedy, you must first understand the doomed man at its center, Tsar Nicholas II. Nicholas inherited the largest, most unwieldy, and most politically backward empire in Europe in 1894. He was deeply devoted to his family, but woefully unprepared to rule a nation on the brink of collapse. The seeds of the revolution were sown not by the Tsar, but by the systemic poverty and the crushing lack of political representation felt by Russia's massive peasant population. But it was the twin disasters of the early 20th century that sealed the Romanovs' fate. The first was the birth of the only male heir, Alexei. The joyous occasion was quickly overshadowed by the revelation that Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a devastating, incurable blood disorder. This secret illness forced the royal couple to seek help from outside the traditional court structure, leading them straight into the arms of the controversial Siberian mystic Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's influence over the Tsarina Alexandra became a symbol of the dynasty's corruption and weakness. The public viewed him as a demonic manipulator, further undermining any remaining trust in the monarchy. The second, and final, nail in the Romanov coffin was World War I. Russia entered the war ill-equipped and poorly led. When Nicholas II decided to take personal command of the army in 1915, a catastrophic decision, he left the hated Alexandra and Rasputin in charge in Petrograd. By February 1917, the Tsar had lost the confidence of the army, the nobility, and the people. Revolution erupted. Nicholas II abdicated, believing he was saving the throne for his son. In reality, he simply signed the death warrant for his entire family. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 300 years, was over. The family was placed under house arrest, beginning a year-long journey toward their terrible, final destination. By February 1917, the Tsar had lost the confidence of the army, the nobility, and the people. Revolution erupted. Nicholas II abdicated, believing he was saving the throne for his son. In reality, he simply signed the death warrant for his entire family. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 300 years, was over. The family was placed under house arrest, beginning a year-long journey toward their terrible, final destination. The deposed imperial family was initially held at the Alexander Palace outside Petrograd, a comfortable prison. But as the political situation dissolved into civil war between the Bolshevik Reds and the counter-revolutionary Whites, the provisional government recognized the Romanovs were a liability. The family was shuffled eastward, eventually arriving in the harsh, industrial city of Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. They were installed in the spacious home of a wealthy merchant named Nikolai Ipatiev. The name the Bolsheviks assigned it was chillingly bureaucratic. The Ipatiev House was renamed the House of Special Purpose. The confinement here was cruel and humiliating. The windows were painted over to prevent the family from seeing the outside world and vice versa. Guards, often crude factory workers and Red Army soldiers, treated the former rulers with open contempt. They played crude music, scratched obscenities on the walls, and stole trinkets from the family's meager possessions. The family spent their final 78 days in a psychological vice. Their fate was actively debated by the Bolshevik leadership, led by Lenin himself. The official line was that the Tsar would be tried publicly. The truth was far simpler. The Bolsheviks knew that as the White Army rapidly approached Yekaterinburg, the Romanovs could be rescued and become a rallying symbol for the counter-revolution. The commandant of the House of Special Purpose was Yakov Yurovsky, a former watchmaker and committed Bolshevik revolutionary. Yurovsky was cold, disciplined, and utterly committed to carrying out his orders. He knew what he was there for. As the White Army's advanced units reached the outskirts of the city in mid-July, the local Soviet command realized they had no time left. They received their final, terrifying order from Moscow: eliminate the family. Yurovsky.com and Methodical began preparing the logistics of a mass execution and disposal. His preparation included mapping out the shallow mine shafts and calculating the necessary amount of sulfuric acid. The execution order arrived late on July 16. Yurovsky, following protocol, read the order to his men. The execution was scheduled for the middle of the night to minimize attention. At around 2 a.m. on July 17, Yurovsky woke the family. They were told there was fighting in the city and they were being moved to the basement for their own safety. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 loyal servants, the physician Dr. Botkin, the cook, Karatanov, the maid Demidova, and the footman Trupwar, ushered down a narrow staircase into a small, windowless basement room. Alexandra requested chairs for herself and the young, severely ill Alexia. The family waited, believing the move was temporary. Minutes later, the execution squad comprising 11 Bolshevik soldiers, armed with revolvers, marched into the room. Yurovsky stepped forward and read a brief, final declaration. Your relatives have tried to save you. They have failed, and we are forced to execute you. Nicholas II only had time to ask, What? Before Yurovsky leveled his pistol and fired a shot directly into the Tsar's chest. What followed was not an execution, but a chaotic, bloody butchery. The room filled instantly with smoke, deafening noise, and blood. The initial volley of fire was ineffective. The assassins were poor shots, and worse. The Grand Duchesses were protected by the very thing they cherished: the heavy corsets they wore. The corsets were stitched with diamonds, pearls, and other jewels, hundreds of pieces weighing nearly 18 pounds. These served as impromptu body armor, deflecting the bullets and turning the execution into a prolonged, horrific struggle. The guards, running out of ammunition and struggling in the smoke-filled room, resorted to bayonets and rifle butts. The young women had to be repeatedly stabbed. The maid, Demidova, survived the initial volley and was chased around the room, desperately fending off the attackers with a small pillow until she was bayoneted to death. The chaos was the key to the mystery. When the shooting stopped, the room was a slaughterhouse. But in the noise and confusion, the assassins had failed to account for 2 specific bodies. When the remains were gathered and dragged out, the executioners knew they had a problem. They had counted 11 dead in the room, but only 9 bodies were accounted for when they reached the disposal site. 2 were missing, either having been lost in the chaos or having escaped entirely. The immediate concern of Yurovsky was not the missing bodies, but the disposal of the 9 they did have. The location chosen was the Four Brothers mineshaft outside the city, a shallow, boggy area. Yurovsky's team attempted to disfigure the corpses immediately. They stripped them naked and doused them repeatedly with sulfuric acid to prevent recognition and identification. The disposal itself was a nightmare. The ground was too marshy, and the bodies refused to sink. Fearing discovery by the approaching White Army, Yurovsky ordered the bodies to be moved again. For 2 days, he desperately tried to find a secure burial site. This is where the official history is filled with contradictory accounts and gaps, all intentional efforts to obscure the truth. On the night of July 18, Yurovsky found a deep, dry spot beneath a railway track crossing known as Koptyaki Road. Here, the remaining 9 bodies were buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. But the official story of the burial itself introduced the crucial ambiguity that would sustain the myth of Anastasia for decades. Yurovsky's own reports stated that 2 bodies were separated from the main group and destroyed completely by fire and acid in a different location. Why were 2 bodies separated? The official, and most widely accepted, account stated that this was done to sow confusion. If the White Army found only part of the family, they could not prove the entire dynasty had been exterminated, thus preventing them from immediately turning the remains into religious or political relics. The identity of the 2 missing bodies was the source of the mystery. One was universally assumed to be the heir, Tsarevich Alexei, whose small, ill body would have been easy to dispose of completely. The other was one of the 4 daughters. Which one? The Bolsheviks provided conflicting reports, but the public fixated on the beautiful, vibrant young women latched onto the idea that the missing daughter was the youngest, the most independent, the one most likely to have fought her way out. Grand Duchess Anastasia Romanov. The White Army arrived in Yekaterinburg just days later, finding the Ipatiev House abandoned and cleaned. Though they initiated a thorough investigation, they could only confirm the execution. They never found the main grave. The Romanovs simply vanished, and where proof ends, legend begins. The myth of the surviving Romanov princess was kept alive not by rumor, but by a single, determined woman. In February 1920, a young woman was pulled from the Landwehr Canal in Berlin after attempting suicide. She was distraught, deeply scarred, and suffering from acute amnesia. She refused to identify herself. and the authorities named her simply Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown. Her refusal to speak German, her aristocratic bearing, and a severe scar on her foot soon caught the attention of a fellow patient. The patient claimed Fräulein Unbekannt bore a resemblance to Grand Duchess Tatiana. When the woman finally spoke, she did so in broken German, mixed with a Slavic accent, and she claimed to be the youngest daughter, Anastasia Romanov. The woman became known as Anna Anderson. Her story of survival was dramatic. She claimed that during the execution, she had been knocked unconscious but not killed. She was revived by a sympathetic guard, Alexander Tchaikovsky, who smuggled her out. They supposedly married, had a child, and lived on the run, suffering terrible injuries, before the guard died and she traveled alone to Europe. The reaction was immediately divided. Many former Romanov courtiers, officers, and even members of the extended family were convinced. She spoke specific, intimate details of palace life, the harem, and the family's possessions that only a true family member could know. She had the mannerisms, the high-arched Romanov feet, and the severe bunions, which she claimed were from an accident in childhood. Her most compelling feature was her profound resemblance to the original Anastasia, particularly in the shape of her eyes and her high cheekbones. However, many others immediately dismissed her as a fraud. Grand Duke Andrei Vladimirovich dismissed her as a street cleaner. Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, Anastasia's aunt, met Anderson and concluded she was not her niece, though she did admit Anderson knew details about the palace she could not explain. The strongest evidence against her identity came from the disappearance of the Grand Duchess's personal funds. If Anastasia had survived, she would have had access to millions in European banks. Anderson never attempted to claim this money legally until later, and she never possessed the deep, innate command of Russian required of a native-born Grand Duchess. The debate paralyzed the surviving Romanovs and captivated the world. Was she a brilliant actress suffering from hysteria, or was she the miraculously surviving princess? This question became the basis for international bestsellers, plays, and eventually, Hollywood films. Anna Anderson never deviated from her claim for nearly 7 decades. She spent the rest of her life pursuing recognition, largely through a series of endless, highly publicized court battles against the German government to establish her identity. The legal fight dragged on for over 30 years, from 1938 until 1970, making it the longest-running civil case in German history. The court was forced to examine every piece of evidence, handwriting analysis, ear-shape comparisons, scar origins, and witness testimony from dozens of people who knew the Romanovs intimately. The court ultimately ruled that while Anna Anderson was not conclusively proven to be Anastasia, she was also not conclusively proven to be an imposter. The case ended in legal limbo, a perfect outcome for a myth that thrived on ambiguity. The constant pressure, the disbelief, and the rigid lifestyle she was forced to maintain the persona of a princess took a profound psychological toll. She was often sickly, depressed, and prone to emotional outbursts. These behaviors were often dismissed by her supporters as understandable reactions to her trauma, while critics saw them as evidence of her instability and Interestingly, the psychological profile of the real Anastasia further complicated the issue. The real Grand Duchess was known for her mischievous, impulsive, and sometimes volatile personality traits that were partially reflected in Anderson. The lines between the real Anastasia's reputed defiance and Anna Anderson's determined persistence blurred. The critical shift in the mystery came when a journalist, years earlier, located the family of a missing Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska. Szankowska had a history of mental illness, scars matching Anderson's, and had vanished after a factory explosion in 1920. At the exact time Anderson appeared in the canal, Szankowska's family was convinced Anderson was Franziska, but the German court found the evidence inconclusive. For the public, the idea of a beautiful princess surviving the night was far more palatable than the reality of a brutal, messy murder. Anna Anderson provided a lifeline to a romantic past that the world desperately wanted to believe still existed. Her story became bigger than the facts. The mystery was finally shattered not by a court, but by a shovel. In 1979, a geologist named Alexander Evdonin and filmmaker Jelly Ryabov, using historical documents, located the mass grave near Kapyaki Road. Fearing the Soviet authorities, they kept the discovery a secret for 12 years. It wasn't until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 that the grave was officially exhumed. The world watched as forensic scientists recovered 9 skeletons, not 11. The original Bolshevik accounts were confirmed. 2 bodies, Tsarevich, Alexei, and one of the daughters, were indeed missing. The remains were subjected to intense forensic and anthropological analysis. The process was agonizing, but definitive. The DNA breakthrough. Scientists in the UK and the US extracted mitochondrial DNA from the remains and compared it with DNA samples taken from surviving Romanov relatives, primarily Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose maternal grandmother was Alexandra's sister. The findings: 1. The 9 skeletons belonged to the Tsar, the Tsarina, 3 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and the 4 servants. The identities were confirmed with 99.9% certainty. 2. Crucially, only 3 of the 4 Grand Duchesses were present. The missing daughter was confirmed to be either Maria or Anastasia. The DNA analysis provided a final, definitive answer to the myth of Anna Anderson. Years before the grave was found, in 1984, Anna Anderson had died in the United States. Following the discovery of the mass grave, scientists requested tissue samples. A small sample of tissue was available, and crucially, a hair sample from her hospital stay in the 1970s. Scientists performed mitochondrial DNA analysis on Anna Anderson's remains and compared them to the Romanov family and the Polish family of Franciszka. The result was final. Anna Anderson's DNA did not match the Romanov line. It did match the DNA of Franciszka Szankowska, the missing Polish factory worker. The woman who claimed to be the Grand Duchess for 70 years was a brilliant, complex imposter suffering from a probable trauma-induced delusion. The myth was over. Though the identity of Anna Anderson was settled, the mystery of the 2 missing Romanov bodies, Alexei and the final daughter Maria or Anastasia, persisted. Did they really escape? Or was Yurovsky telling the truth about burning them? In 2007, an amateur history enthusiast, using newly released Bolshevik archival maps, found the true, second, smaller gravesite in a clearing less than 70 meters from the main burial. The recovery was meticulous. The remains consisted of a young male with hemophilia and a young female, both burned and disfigured by acid. DNA testing was conducted on these final 2 bodies. Scientists compared the DNA to the remains of the 9 others and confirmed the final conclusive truth. The 2 bodies belonged to Tsarevich Alexei and the missing Grand Duchess. The Romanov family was whole again. The DNA proved all 5 children were executed on the night of July 17, 1918. The historical uncertainty was erased. The missing daughter was identified as Maria. This means that the 3 daughters recovered in the main grave were Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia. The 2 bodies separated and burned were Alexei and Maria. But for 70 years, the legend fixed on Anastasia, ironically saving her name as the enduring symbol of the Romanov myth. The story of the Romanov massacre is a definitive reminder that history is often less romantic than legend. The family did not escape. There was no miraculous rescue. There was only a chaotic, terrifying, and brutal end in a dank basement. The persistence of the Anastasia myth wasn't about Anna Anderson's skill as an imposter. It was about the psychological need of the public. The Romanov family, especially the Tsar's daughters, represented a fairy tale past destroyed by the grim reality of communism and war. To believe Anastasia survived was to believe that the Tsar's line and the romantic ideals they embodied were still alive. Today, the bodies of the Romanovs rest in St. Petersburg, officially canonized as passion bearers by the Russian Orthodox Church. The mystery of their fate is solved, but the tragedy remains one of history's most profound examples of a dynasty consumed by revolution. The secret wasn't that Anastasia survived. The secret was how long the world was willing to believe a lie, simply because the truth was too painful.